My name is Richard Hutchison. My preferred surname is Rick. I was born in 1942 in New Brighton, Pennsylvania. My father was a Presbyterian minister, and shortly after my birth, because it was that period of time, my father left his parish, his pastorate, and joined the United States Army Air Corps as a chaplain. So during the war years, 1942 through 1945, my father was assigned to the United States Army Air Corps in the Pacific Theater. My mother and I returned to Princeton, New Jersey, where her family was from. We spent, as I think most people did in those days, daughters returned home with their children while the husbands went away to war. And we spent that, that period of time in Princeton, New Jersey. After Princeton, my father resumed his profession as a pastor. We moved to Union, New Jersey, where he had a pastorate. From there, we went to Albany, New York, and finally we moved to Lake Forest, Illinois, where I spent my high school years, graduated from high school, and from that point I went off to college. Graduated from Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania in 1965. The following year, I went to Northern Illinois University to pursue a master's degree in English literature. After the completion of my first year, I was offered a position as a teaching assistant. However, that was dependent upon the fact that I was still receiving my student deferment. At that time, of course, we were all participating in the draft. And much to my surprise, my student deferment had expired, and I was no longer deferred. Rather than seeking a legitimate way to get out of being drafted into the armed forces of the United States, I elected to talk to Army recruiters and Navy recruiters and Marine Corps recruiters, and the Army recruiter made me a proposition I couldn't refuse. He guaranteed that if I just signed up for 3 years, he'd keep me for at least a year and a half in all sorts of schools. That was attractive. I thought I'd probably be able to avoid Vietnam, and so I joined the Army. And that brings me to the Army period. Would you like me to continue on?
Yeah, no, you're doing great.
Oh.
That was my next one is brief overview of how you got into the military, your time there. Like,
Okay.
did you get drafted? Did you not?
Well,
I have no idea.
I wasn't drafted. I did actually volunteer. And I recall at the time asking the recruiter what I was going to do. And he told me I was going to be an area intelligence specialist. I had no idea what that meant, and neither did the recruiter. He said, "Oh, you'll be in civilian clothes," which I thought was kind of neat. I thought that was kind of cool. And I didn't really believe him. But I went to the Army. I went through my basic training at Fort Polk, Louisiana. I was then sent to Fort Holabird in Maryland, in the Dundalk, a suburb of Baltimore, and where I was trained as an area intelligence specialist. That's something of a misnomer. Area intelligence specialist, to my mind, was that I would be sitting in a pleasant room somewhere, reading intelligence reports and drafting and composing area summaries regarding geographic areas. I mean, after all, what would an area intelligence specialist do? I was wrong. That's not at all what we did. We were the somewhat vestigial piece of the old OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. We were to be trained to be the people who would be responsible for going behind enemy lines, creating havoc, recruiting agents to create havoc, and bothersome things. And so I ended up in the intelligence business in the United States Army for the next 22 years. The first 3 of those years, I was an enlisted man in the Army, but at the end of after 2 years, it was suggested to me that the Army needed officers now that I had been trained as an intelligence officer, because the training between the enlisted and the officers for this particular skill set in the Army it was identical. And because I had been sent off to German language school, and by the way, I did avoid Vietnam. I went to Germany immediately following German language school. So I was in Germany when it was suggested to me that it might be fun for me, and certainly more profitable if I became an officer. And so I did. I applied and received what is called a direct appointment as an officer. A little bit unusual, but they were unusual times. It was a period of time when we were chewing officers up over in Vietnam. Young lieutenants were going over there, doing their service, immediately leaving the service of the Army or becoming casualties. So there were lots of officer vacancies. So they were just happy to get me as an officer. Now, of course, that did mean that I was going to go to Vietnam. And I did. I went to Vietnam 2 times. Came back to the United States after my first tour in Vietnam for just a 1-year period. Then immediately went back to Vietnam. In those days, you were either going to Vietnam, you were in Vietnam, or you had just come back from Vietnam. And that's what you were. And if you were an enlisted person with just a 2 or 3 year commitment, you would cycle out. There was a great deal of churn in the Army at that particular point in time. However, I had been in Germany. I had been in Germany for already 1.5 years before I went to Vietnam. But when I returned from Vietnam the second time, I went back over to Germany, and then spent the next 12 years in Germany, in various locations, near Frankfurt, in Munich, Germany, and in Berlin, Germany, before returning to the United States, where I met my wonderful wife, purely by happenstance, in Annapolis, Maryland. And I believe she really thought we were going to get married and I was going to take her off again to some wonderful foreign place and we would have a wonderful time. But I spent the remainder of my career here in the United States. And so after 22 years, I retired from the U.S. military at the rank of a lieutenant colonel. And then I've had 2 different jobs since that period of time. I have been a retained executive search consultant. I did that for 6 years. And I have been a residential mortgage loan officer for about 15 years. And I think I'll retire soon. And that brings you up to date.
There you go. So, did you have a choice in becoming an officer? Or was it kind of like...
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, I could have said no.
Oh, okay.
And I certainly could have said no. And it was a very odd situation. Direct appointments there aren't many of them. Normally, a person enters the service as a direct appointment. For example, individuals who are brought into the Judge Advocate General's Corps are often brought in as direct appointments, but they're drawn straight from the, or medical people, they're drawn straight in from the civilian world and enter the Army as an officer. I was a sergeant, and it's very interesting. You're a sergeant one day, and the next day you're a second lieutenant. The amusing aspect of it is everyone respects a sergeant. Very few people have a great deal of respect for a second lieutenant. So it's a very interesting transition to make. But I had a choice, and I just elected to be an officer.
Was it very difficult knowing you'd have to go to Vietnam if you chose to
Not
be an officer? You were like at that point it didn't matter?
at that particular time. At that particular time, it didn't bother me at all. And I'm not really sure why. Obviously, I was surrounded by people who had just come back from Vietnam. They had been to Vietnam. They had done it. Once you were involved in the Army, you were more open to going to where everyone else, your colleagues had gone. It was time for you to go.
Oh, so it was
a leitmotif. It was a common theme that kind of flowed through the entire thing. As I say, you were either in Vietnam, you are going to Vietnam or you just come from Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were going to be in the Army for any length of time, this is what you did. By the way, when I became an officer, I had no intention of remaining in the Army whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to fill 3 years as an officer and get out.
So what ultimately was the motivation to become an officer versus
Enlisted?
go back?
Enlisted rather than well, first of all, it actually, yes, the job I had, I didn't enjoy as an enlisted man.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't enjoy it at all. And I felt that although I had received excellent training, I was not being used in that capacity. I was being used in a clerical role, and I didn't want to be used in a clerical role.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that by becoming an officer, I would be taken away from that.
Approximately how old were you at the time?
Let me see, I joined kind of late. Let me see.
So you were already in college. So.
Oh, well, no, I was finished with college. I was in
Oh,
graduate
yeah, you
school.
were in grad school.
So, 22, 23, 24. I was, I think, I was 24 when I entered the Army,
Mm-hmm.
and I was 26 when I became an officer.
Interesting. Did you ever at any point, once you chose that you were going to career military, do you ever have any regrets looking back that like I wish I hadn't gone that path? I wish I had tried harder to get a student deferment again, or?
Actually, no.
Mm-hmm.
No, I never felt that way particularly. Many people did get student deferments. Many people manipulated the system.
Mm-hmm.
The reality of today, that I'll use as a somewhat analogous situation, students of privileged families getting access to colleges of their choice. People of privilege back in those days avoided the draft with very little effort, and I think I probably could have avoided it. But candidly, it didn't occur to me. Truth of the matter was, I was getting kind of bored with graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really enjoy it as much as I thought I would. And candidly, I almost breathed a sigh of relief when I found out my student deferment had expired.
Interesting. Okay. Going back to officer training school, I know that's not what it's called, but you get the gist.
Didn't go.
Oh, that's right. You just jumped right in, huh?
No, I didn't go to officers training school. I mean, it's good training. There's nothing wrong with it. It's perfectly fine. I just didn't go.
Oh, is that what it means by like direct appointment? That they just like you don't have to go through the process. You just get
you're
stuck
one day,
in. Like here you go.
They essentially they wave a magic
Here's
wand.
your new.
They wave a magic wand and you're an officer. And believe me, it sounds unusual, and it was a little unusual in my position because I was an enlisted person
Mm-hmm.
who was being turned into an officer by the wave of the magic wand. But it actually does happen in others, in certain specialized fields.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as I mentioned, law, medical, people automatically come in at a particular rank. My father, for example, when he, as a joining at the Army as a chaplain, he joined as a lieutenant.
Okay. So, do you think you learned anything in that capacity while you were doing your training that you've taken with you, like through your whole life, like certain themes or elements of that, ways to work, even specific things you learned that you've like carried the whole way?
Good question. I haven't been posed that one before. Let me think. I'm going to give you a weak answer in that this is something I'd really like to spend some time thinking about before I give you an impudent. Certain things, yes, were absolutely tremendous. Tremendous training, and I have carried with me forever. The absolute necessity for attention to detail.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you don't pay attention to the little things, they will bite you in the butt and they'll be troublesome to you. The value of personal loyalty to other people. very, very important to me. The value of integrity, being absolutely forthright and candid and with other human beings was inculcated in me. The sense that you are being held to a higher standard than other people, that other people can stumble and fall, but you are expected not to. You are being held to a higher moral, ethical standard than other people. And when you fall, and you will, people do fall, it is more impactful to you as an individual. So those are things that I would say the training, the sense, the military service certainly inculcated that in me.
Do you feel like the training you received was adequate for when you went into the field, or did you have to learn a lot on your
No,
feet?
my training was absolutely brilliant. It was wonderful. However, my training was very, very different than the training that other members of the military got. As I look at the military today, I would say that the young people who go into the military today receive far better training than most of my comrades in arms received, especially the combat arms training. The combat arms training today is so far superior than the combat arms training that we had. We were adjusting from the Second World War. It's just better, and the guys are better trained now. I think my training, on the other hand, the intelligence training and the sort of things that I did was really quite good.
Good to know. So you're kind of mentioning this. So while you're in Vietnam, how would you characterize, or what did your specific duties or roles encompass?
I was in Vietnam twice, and my roles were quite different each time I was there. The first time I was there, I was assigned to the headquarters of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam. I was a very, very junior and minor staff officer during my period of time there, and essentially moved paper around through because there's paper to be moved. A good deal of time was also spent with special units that were out in the field, and talking and debriefing the various members of those special units for information that they had developed as they were out in the field. And so I would bring that information back. Intelligence reports would be written. It would go into the vast database of intelligence that the field commanders would use to make their decisions on what to do. So it was primarily it was a very significant support role, but it was one that essentially involved visiting lots of strange little posts scattered about Vietnam, and talking with people who spent a lot of time going out into very dangerous situations, but came back with valuable information.
What about the second time?
The second time I had a small unit in Vietnam that was responsible for intelligence collection, and my people would, I and my people would develop sources of information to help protect our bases. In other words, if we could know that in advance of the intentions of our opponents, whether it was the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese regulars, it would be, it would save American lives and might save some civilian lives as well. So my people were responsible for developing nets of agents throughout a chunk of Vietnam, geography in Vietnam, to provide intelligence information to support our operations.
So what kind of tactics do you use to accomplish that? Like, how do you go about doing that?
Well, there are lots of things. Intelligence is a broad field, and there's electronic intelligence. I think we're all acquainted with that. I was not in that particular piece of it. I was in what is loosely called human intelligence, and so what we were involved in was getting individuals, people, to agree to assist us by providing us with information about where they lived and what was happening in those particular sections or areas. So what we would get is we would get folks who were assisting us and they would be met by us or intermediaries. We would recruit someone. That person would be responsible for going out and recruiting their own network of people, and then they would all report back in.
How were you were just responsible for gathering, no interpretation, so it didn't matter?
No.
It wasn't your job to figure out if they were lying or not, it was just your job to get
Oh,
the
you know,
information?
well, of course we had to know whether they were
Well,
lying.
yeah, but like, how do you...
And there are a number of ways that you do that. You cross-reference pieces of information to see whether it's validated by other pieces of information. You can use things like the polygraph to assess whether someone is being truthful or not, or being deceptive. Or you can send the information forward, and the information is bounced against all sorts of other sources. I mean, we have not only information that comes from human beings, but we have information that comes from electronic sources, from radio intercepts and things like that. So, and then if we find out that somebody is, and it does happen, yes, if somebody is fabricating information, they can be fabricating information for a lot of reasons. They can be fabricating information because they want a job and they want money. They can be fabricating information because they're a member of the bad guys team and they're just trying to feed us bad information. But there are lots, but it does happen, and usually we ferret them out. And by the way, when we ferret them out, we just fire them. That's all.
Okay. How did you handle like being homesick while you were over there?
I wasn't.
You weren't homesick ever?
Isn't that interesting? I really didn't have a sense of being homesick at all.
You didn't miss America at all? You didn't miss your family at all? Like
I
there
didn't
was
miss America a
nothing?
bit. I loved being in a foreign country.
Mm-hmm.
I've always loved going to foreign countries. I loved being in Vietnam. I liked the Vietnamese. I liked the culture. I liked everything about it, except the war.
I was like, except the war. Were any of the members of your team pretty homesick, or was that a pretty current theme? Like, while everybody was there, you're there. Like,
every now and then we would have someone who had real issues with being separated from family, but they were few and far between. There's a camaraderie that exists. You kind of bolster each other there. There's a sense of unity and belonging within the organization, and that really takes the place of many things. Now, I'm not saying I'm just my own experience is that very few of my compatriots and the folks under my command or my contemporaries were terribly homesick. Remember, it was a year tour. It was a very finite thing. The Vietnam War was divided into 1 year chunks. You arrived in Vietnam, you were counting the days that you were going to be in Vietnam from the day that you arrived. And people kept calendars on when they were going to leave. So it was finite. It was just a year, and everybody kind of knew that.
that's cool. This is more of a general thing. Like, were there any individuals or situations of note from that time, like good or bad, you would want to share?
Well, there are always things there are always things you can share. There are there are unfortunate and ugly things that happen in war, and the unfortunate and ugly things are generally things that those of us who have been in combat or have been exposed to them, I, along with most of the other people that I know, generally do not discuss it. It is a terrible and frightening thing. There is nothing that can quite compare to being in a position where you are expected to, if necessary, take the lives of other human beings, where that is laudable, where that is necessary. And there's nothing worse than seeing the horrific damage that is done to a human body by shells and projectiles and explosions. It is absolutely unspeakable. So the things that I can recall, I can remember amusing things. I can remember horrific things. I can remember talking with one of my sub-agents, and he was saying, you know, I really don't like going up there. You know, I mean, they're really horrible animals up there. And I said, yeah, but they're South Vietnamese animals. They're not North Vietnamese animals. You'll be able to handle it. And I remember us bursting into laughter at the absurdity of that. And this wonderful guy, who, by the way, I think is still alive and may still be over in Vietnam somewhere. But this wonderful guy, he and I just laughing at each other over the absurdity of some remark like that. So there are pieces of it that certainly can be shared, but to be perfectly honest, most of the nitty-gritty stuff is not suitable. Not suitable for sharing. And many of my compatriots have trouble with that. And I think probably all of us who came back have some issues, have some post-traumatic stress issues. And I'm certainly sure that I am one of them. And I don't know of anybody who doesn't have it. Now that is a long and convoluted way of saying I'm not really answering your question.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Let's go back to like friendships and stuff like that. Like, can you talk about any specific individuals who like really impacted your time there, or in, like, you know, you continued correspondence with after the fact?
One of the very fortunate aspects of the little piece of the military that I was part of is that it's a relatively small community. So consequently, for example, the second time I went back to Vietnam, I was walking back into units and organizations where I knew people. There were people I knew from the United States, people I knew from Germany. They were friends. I knew many of them. Best example, an example. The day after I arrived back in Vietnam the second time, I was taken to one of the small headquarters units that was on this lovely campus, kind of a compound, wall around the compound, and a couple of very nice villas in it. And I remember I was being taken around by a very junior captain who didn't know anybody, but on the other hand, I knew everybody there. And so he was taking me around, and it was Old Home Week, and we were standing there, and it was wonderful. We were chatting away, and kept noticing that the captain was nervous over my shoulder. He was agitated. And I was thinking, well, he's probably embarrassed because I know all of his men very well, and I'll cut this short, we'll save face. And I remember I turned to leave, and suddenly the captain pointed at the floor at my feet and said, "Look out," at the top of his voice. And I looked down, and between my feet there was this huge constrictor going going between my feet. And I, of course, went completely berserk and shot up into the air, landed on the table, was clawing at my weapon because I was going to shoot something. And before everybody calmed me down and explained that was the pet snake. And and that was the reason the captain was so nervous. There are incidents like that. The young captain and I became very good friends thereafter. And, he said, "My God, I thought you were going to step on Susie." So yes, there were wonderful people. There were great people over there that I met, and many of them I stayed close to throughout my military career.
That's good. Just like two more on this note. What was it like coming back to the States?
Well, you must remember at that particular point in time, the war in Vietnam, quite appropriately, I might add, was, to my way of thinking, the war in Vietnam was extremely unpopular with a large segment of the United States. I would not say a majority of the United States, but a very large segment of it, a large minority, let's call it. Coming back to the United States, many times soldiers were warned to take off their uniforms when they got back to the United States and travel across the United States in civilian clothes rather than be in uniform because of the harassment that they would undergo. And indeed, I experienced that to a minor degree a couple of times, but I was very fortunate in that I didn't spend a great deal of time in the United States. I went to Vietnam, I came back, I spent a 1-year period of time in the United States, went back to Vietnam, came back and went immediately to Germany. The only thing I did was stop off to visit parents, family, and then off to Germany we went. And then I stayed in Germany for the remainder, almost the significant part of the remainder of my career. However, it was a hostile environment coming back to the United States if you were a U.S. military member. And it is something that still to this day bothers me. But it's over, it's done with. People are going out of their way to pat us on the head now. I appreciate it. It's okay.
You feel like it's too little too late, though?
It's a long time in the past. Vietnam's going to become a marvelous trading partner with the United States, where everything is fine. Vietnam's a lovely country. The war itself was absolute idiocy. I knew within 2 weeks from the first time I arrived in Vietnam that it was an absolutely hopeless cause. And candidly, I agreed with most of the demonstrators in the United States. I absolutely did. I felt it was an absolutely foolish effort. So there's one part of me that agreed with the people who were, condemning my actions, baby killers, that sort of thing. And that's what many of these kids were called, and that was very, very hurtful. As I say, I didn't experience a whole lot of that, a little bit, but not a whole lot.